Hey guys, so these are your surface water 2.4 surface water notes. Go ahead and open up your packet to page 7. And the first part in your notes says to look at that picture. And what does the picture look like? Think about it for a second. Most of you are probably thinking a pond or some kind of lake maybe. In general, we would call it surface water, and it is surface water. Surface water is any kind of water that you find at the surface. Rivers, lakes, streams, things of that nature. Even oceans are considered surface water. And some of you may have noticed that it's kind of green and gross looking, which is actually a problem. It's not a super healthy source of surface water because it's kind of green like that, and we'll talk about that towards the end of the notes. So first we're going to talk about river systems. I know you've learned about river systems before, probably in social studies class actually, so we'll do a really quick review. A river and all of its tributaries make up a river system. So you have the beginning of the river, so water on earth flows down because of gravity. So usually our river system starts at high elevation, like up in the mountains, and the beginning of a river system is called the headwaters. So where it begins up in the mountains, headwaters. Then it kind of flows and meanders back and forth or moves back and forth. So a meander is just that kind of bend that's in the river system, all the way down to the mouth of the river. The mouth of the river is where the river ends up pouring into the ocean. And a few other things that you have part of the river system, the floodplain. The floodplain would be if it was to rain really hard and there was a lot of extra water and the river was to overflow its boundaries. The floodplain is a lower lying area surrounding the river where it would flood. The extra water would go. So that's a floodplain. A tributary is a smaller little stream or river that kind of comes into a bigger river. So this right here is a tributary. And then lastly, we have an oxbow lake. The place where a river is formed is not always permanent. It changes a lot depending on when rivers overflow their boundaries or they just kind of change over time. The water is carving a space in the earth, and that's what causes the river to be able to flow. So sometimes the pattern of its meanders, its curves, changes a little bit. And when that happens, this river actually used to meander or flow over here. It has since changed its path and kind of straightened out a little bit, but it left behind this little area that's holding water, and that's called an oxbow lake. So that is a river system. The land area that supplies water to a river system is called a watershed. Sometimes we call that a river basin or a drainage basin. They all mean the same thing. The map is showing you some of the major watersheds of the United States. So we have the Columbia River watershed over here. This is just area that flows into the Columbia River. There's a Great Basin, the Colorado River watershed, and then the Mississippi River watershed is pretty big, Missouri River watershed, and the Ohio River shed. So again, this is the land area that the water flows over top of and eventually leads into one of these really main rivers of the United States. A divide is a ridge of land that separates watersheds. So you can kind of think of a drainage basin, river shed or watershed or river basin as a bowl. At the higher elevations, the ridge of a mountain, that's your divide. So from here, if rain were to fall down from these clouds, it would hit here, and then because of gravity, it's going to flow downhill into this lower lying kind of valley area. This lower lying valley area where the water is collecting is the watershed or the river basin. So depending, if you have a mountain, it's a high point, when water falls, it's either going to go down one side of it or it's going to go down the other side. This would be one watershed or river basin, and on the other side of the mountain there would be another watershed or river basin. So again, a watershed river basin is just a name for the area of land that water is flowing over leading to a river, because rivers are at the low lying point in a valley somewhere. All right, so lakes can change. Lakes are another example of surface water like rivers, and sometimes they change and sometimes not for a good reason. So this thing is called eutrophication. It's a big fancy word, but eutrophication is a process where nutrients, which is good stuff for plants, builds up in a lake and causes more algae to grow. It can lead to the death of a lake or pond eventually. So in these little pictures are kind of showing you the process of that. It says the process begins as algae and other organisms add nutrients to the lake. These nutrients support more plant growth. So plants like nutrients, and as the plants kind of absorb these nutrients from a nearby source, maybe like a farm is putting nitrates on their crops to help their plants grow, well, eventually sometimes those nitrates or fertilizers end up in a nearby water system. And when that happens, the nitrates get in the water system and allow things like algae and this moss and things of that nature on the side of the lake to start growing more rapidly. So here's kind of the middle section where it's soil, fallen leaves, and decaying matter piles up, and also on the bottom of the lake, and then eventually you can lose the whole source of water altogether. It's completely filled in with vegetation now, and that's a problem. I mentioned a second ago, eutrophication is caused by nitrates. If you refer back to or recall back to the nitrogen cycle, we talked about how plants really like nitrogen. It allows them to make proteins and allows them to grow big and strong. So farmers and people that want to grow really healthy plants will put fertilizers on their plants to help them grow. The fertilizers are made of nitrates, which is a nitrogen and oxygen compound that's essential for plants to grow. The problem with that is that when a farmer, for instance, puts fertilizer on his crop, it doesn't just stay on his corn crop. Water flows across the surface into leading nearby areas like little tiny streams and stuff, and then those little streams lead into bigger streams. And some of that water and fertilizer along with it will seep through and become part of the groundwater and then flow to some other bigger source of water. So just like pollution, anything else that enters the water cycle and enters the nearby water source eventually leads to a bigger water supply. And here we can see this water supply is probably nearby somewhere where they've been using fertilizers. And this green stuff, the algae and stuff, is starting to grow. And that's called, again, eutrophication. So those are your surface water notes.